Hey everyone, let's cast our minds back to 2026. The world was quite literally teetering on the edge of a massive, catastrophic war. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the Islamabad Memorandum. It's that fragile yet incredibly historic peace deal that basically hit the pause button on a total Middle Eastern meltdown.
Here's a quick look at what we're going to cover today. We'll start with the 2026 conflict, walk through the timeline of negotiations, and then break down the Islamabad Memorandum itself. After that, we'll look at the nuclear limits and sanctions, see the global reactions, and finally discuss that super fragile 60-day window.
All right, let's jump right into part one, the 2026 conflict.
So things escalated insanely fast. On February 28, 2026, war broke out on pretty much all fronts. This wasn't just a localized skirmish, it threatened global oil supplies and the entire world economy. Fast forward to mid-April, and the initial peace talks in Islamabad totally failed, with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance actually walking out and heading home. And literally the next day, April 12th, President Donald Trump implemented a strict naval blockade of Iran. The stakes were absolutely sky high.
Which brings us to part two, the timeline of the negotiations. How did they even get back to the table?
Well, it took some serious heavy lifting. Between June 11th and 14th, Pakistan and Qatar stepped up with some intense shuttle diplomacy, and they actually managed to mediate a breakthrough. On June 14th, we saw something unprecedented, an MOU digitally signed by both the US and Iran. A few days later, on June 17th, we got this crazy split-screen moment of formal signings. President Trump at the Palace of Versailles in France and President Pezeshkian over in Tehran.
Okay, moving on to part three, the Islamabad Memorandum explained. What exactly did they agree to?
It was essentially a massive, high-stakes quid pro quo. Under point one, both sides agreed to immediately halt all military operations, a simultaneous step back. In exchange, the U.S. promised to end its naval blockade and pull its forces back within 30 days. On the flip side, Iran guaranteed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz toll-free for commercial vessels for 60 days. This was the crucial move that kept global oil flowing and let the whole world breathe a huge sigh of relief.
And then there's this jaw-dropping number, $300 billion. That was point six of the memorandum. The U.S. and its regional partners promised this massive reconstruction and economic development fund to basically help rebuild Iran from the ground up.
Let's move to part four, nuclear limits and sanctions. This is where the real geopolitical heavy lifting happened.
They basically set a ticking clock, just a 60-day window, to negotiate a final deal. Under the MOU, Iran agreed to maintain the nuclear status quo and downblend enriched material under the watchful eye of the IAEA. In return, the U.S. immediately issued waivers for Iranian oil exports and unfroze Iranian funds. But, and this is a big but, the complete termination of all sanctions was entirely dependent on actually reaching that final deal.
Now, Iranian leadership did endorse the deal, but they weren't exactly hiding their hesitation. In the words of Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, मोहतरम सदर ने मुझे यकीन दानी कराई है, तहफ़्फ़ुज़ात के बावजूद मैं इसकी मंजूरी देता हूं. Basically saying the honorable president gave him a commitment, so he approved it despite his reservations. It really shows how anxious they were internally about the fallout.
Meanwhile, the U.S. side was giving absolutely zero leeway. President Donald Trump made his stance crystal clear, warning, अगर ये 60 दिनों में मुकम्मल नहीं होता, तो कोई बात नहीं, हम दोबारा बमबारी शुरू कर देंगे. Literally saying if it doesn't get done in 60 days, that's fine, we just go back to bombing. It wasn't just a procedural deadline, it was a hardcore zero-tolerance ultimatum about nuclear weapons.
All right, part five, global reactions and violations. Let's see how the rest of the world handled this.
The reactions were completely night and day. On one hand, you had immense relief. Global oil prices stabilized almost instantly, and European allies were praising the de-escalation. But on the other hand, U.S. allies in the Middle East were furious. Israeli officials openly called the deal terrible and flat-out refused to leave Lebanon. In Gulf states, they were incredibly frustrated because the deal didn't place any limits on Iranian missiles,
Which leads us right into part six, a fragile 60-day window.
Guys, the ink wasn't even dry before the whole thing started unraveling. Just 2 days later, on June 19th, Israeli strikes and Hezbollah retaliation completely shattered the ceasefire in Lebanon. The very next day, Iran retaliated by reclosing the Strait of Hormuz. By June 26th, the IRGC Navy was forcing oil tankers to turn back, and the U.S. was launching retaliatory strikes. The incredibly complex web of regional conflicts was just tearing the MOU apart. Things deteriorated so fast that by July 8, 2026, President Trump essentially declared the deal over due to the ongoing violations in the Strait of Hormuz. Just like that, the entire diplomatic process was thrown into a massive crisis.
So, what does this all mean? Can the Islamabad Memorandum somehow survive this incredibly tight 60-day deadline, or is the Middle East just destined to fall into a much wider, devastating war? I guess only time will tell.
For more content, please follow the Educationist page.